to the invention of the first automobile, the auto show. But it would be until after World War II when hot rodders and customizers banded together to throw the first car shows. And since that time, there's been a car show for every scene. Concerts, cruising, and tire smoke, many of these shows have become automotive festivals. We finished off the mini truck history. We did 4 parts kind of throughout the decades, if you will. Pretty cool, pretty well received for a lot of the nostalgia purposes.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be continuing going through different genres of custom vehicles, but we're also going to insert some other aspects of it, because one of the big things that we saw with especially the mini trucks was the shows. Shows became a really big part of it. But we're going to save that because we're going to have some special guests on that.
Yes.
Frank Good and...
I was just going to say.
Sorry, guys. Maybe we'll leave this in. Brian Good.
There you go.
Frank Newton. They do Grinder TV, Custom Life, and they're the Drop with Frank and Brian podcast. And obviously with that, Brian's, held several shows, Forbidden Fantasy show for almost 30 years now. Been heavily involved. They travel to a lot of shows. So those will be some perfect guys to key in for the truck shows. But we're going to be talking about car shows today.
That's right. And we're not just talking about only the New Balance Nationals. We're going to go deep.
Yeah. You got some uniforms and stuff going, but or the Rascal Nationals,
That's true, too.
The National Association of Rascal.
Right. Get your cut.
Yeah. So we're going to start it off, though, going back to obviously the beginning, and that's with auto shows.
Correct.
We're going to differentiate between car shows and auto shows.
Because there is a difference.
There is a difference, and historically there's been a difference, and there's obviously a different, aspect of it. Auto shows are kind of more for the manufacturers,
right?
The OEMs. Several of them, especially like the LA Auto Show, they've brought in some custom exhibitors and custom shops and stuff like that. But traditionally, it has been a place where companies can debut a concept car, the new model year, interact with obviously press. There's always press days. Kind of basically, it's more of a general public auto show.
Yeah, and those shows obviously are also. Boy, now we can't even talk, right? Those shows are also used for sales tools, because a lot of the dealership, the local dealer association will work with the manufacturer to co-op. So, for every, brand, Toyota through, Nissan, Cadillac, all those
Chevy.
guys, they'll work with those manufacturers and say, look, we're going to put on our display at the LA Auto Show. What's the new latest and greatest, and what kind of sales tools can we get away? So it is kind of, in a way, they're showing people what they want to sell.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a lot of times you'll get, the stuff there that's debuted that maybe never even goes on the dealership floor. Concept cars, you'll get kind of the first peek of that, and that's used to display it.
And get dealers get customer reactions,
and that's
too.
A lot of it too. I mean, and obviously we know with concept cars, you're seeing the most radical versions a lot of times that then get toned down. Safety and engineering and manufacturing come into play.
Right.
But that's kind of, for me, that's kind of one of the cool things about the auto shows is you get to see something that is fairly radical coming from an OEM, and maybe you'll see something similar in the future.
Yeah.
So the very first auto show is actually in France, in Paris, France, and that was 1894.
Okay. The car was invented like in 1890 something, right?
No, and so obviously, there
car before the horse on this, or
well, no, the first recognized car was from Carl Benz,
right?
Mercedes Benz,
yes,
and that was 1885, 1886, and that was a 3-wheel, powered car. But basically, that's what's considered the very first automobile for what we have, and. So you're thinking, a couple of years later, essentially, you probably had to get more than just one guy making a car to do a car show or an auto show, because you just go to that guy's shop.
It would just
or that
be the
garage.
Benz show.
Yeah,
right?
It's the Benz show or something like that.
Yeah.
So that was 1894. And then London, England, was the next year, 1895.
Okay.
We didn't see any of that in the U.S. until 1899. the very end of the century.
Okay.
And that was the Detroit Auto Show.
Makes sense.
And that was basically the first automotive show, and one of the guys that helped kind of put that together. If we had to point somebody influential for this back then, it would be this guy, William Metzger.
Okay.
So he actually had traveled to London, traveled to Germany, visited, some of the manufacturers. He got his start. He was the first to open an auto dealership in the country in Detroit.
Okay.
He was part of Cadillac.
Okay.
He sold Oldsmobile cars there, and eventually he teamed up with several people, started the EMF car company, and that was then sold by Studebaker.
Okay.
So basically, he was heavily involved in this. He actually started what's considered the first sanctioned auto race in 1901 in Detroit, the
Really?
Detroit Auto Race. Yeah. So William Metzger, hats off to you. You were seeing this at the very beginning and going for it. But the very first big show,
Okay.
or what is considered like the most modern modern auto show,
Right.
happened in New York,
Okay.
and that was the next year. Yeah.
So, New York, you're probably thinking like Madison Square Garden, humongous show. Even like the Automobile Club of America was formed around that show,
And that's
wasn't it?
they sponsored that show. So
Right.
this was like the first like nationally sanctioned, official kind of show, and that was that was the New York Auto Show in Madison Square Garden.
Okay.
And you look at it and you go, okay, there's a few dozen cars.
Sure.
There's companies there that it's been noted that none of the exhibitors or manufacturers exist today.
Right.
You had a lot of these little small startup companies that maybe got folded into another company, or something like your Oldsmobile or whatever. They're Cadillac, Cadillac's around, but a company that's not around anymore.
Stutz.
Basically, Stutz. Maybe you're.
Those kind of weird, Jewett, strange, auto car, all those weird, names that we had from the turn
and
of
then
the
I think there was
century.
one who was like McFay or McCaffrey's Auto. So it was like I said, just someone starting up their own thing, and it either didn't take off or it got folded in, bought out.
And that makes a lot of sense, because my great uncle Barney Oldfield, who obviously was the speed demon of those times and was known as the daredevil of his world. He would talk to my grandmother and show pictures and send letters about barnstorming, where they would just go from city to city and kind of bring their show along with it. Mm-hmm. But to him, it was the auto shows what made the most sense, because he got the most exposure out of those.
Yeah.
So I mean, he like the Chicago Auto Show was something that he attended every year. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I believe it was the largest auto show in the world. I mean, I know shows like now, like SEMA dwarf.
Well, no.
That,
Chicago started in 1901.
Okay.
So, literally the following year.
Yeah.
So obviously you can tell, like, okay, and William Metzger was a part of the New York Auto Show.
Okay.
He helped with that. So it's, you start seeing, okay, every year something else pops up.
Yeah.
And a lot of times maybe, they were touring it around.
Right.
Starting these up. Currently the Chicago Auto Show is the largest in the U.S. It's about the same, and I don't know necessarily if SEMA's counting just internal convention center space
right.
or all the outside stuff and outdoors and
Yeah.
all that, but they're both 1.2 million
Wow.
square feet
Yeah.
for the auto show, and then obviously SEMA's more of a car show, trade show, industry
Right.
show, and they call it the world's largest aftermarket show.
Yes, that's true.
So
yeah.
but one thing that's kind of interesting is at the New York Auto Show, how it was advertised was electric cars,
Yeah.
steam-powered cars,
Right.
and internal explosion cars.
Wow.
So, we talked about the, history of the electric vehicle and how, 100 plus years ago, they had electric vehicles and they were competing with the gas, and obviously gas internal combustion kind of won out. But they were, some of the marketing on that was, well, do you want to use something that, powers the street lights and
Right.
maybe your home
Yeah.
at the time, or you want something that's thousands of explosions inside of your car every second.
Right, yeah.
So that was kind of some of the marketing. So it was interesting to see that.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads in a little bit to the LA Auto Show.
Okay.
So that was 1907.
Okay.
So a couple years later. And that's obviously still goes on today.
Yeah.
They have the automobility show, kind of bringing in some of the, smaller scale personal transportation companies. But in 1929, the show caught fire.
Okay.
There was an airplane exhibit, and some electrical in one of the airplanes short-circuited, caught on fire, and I think they were saying in today's money, about $17 million in damage.
Wow.
But the whole community kind of, LA, obviously a lot smaller at the time, everybody came together, and the very next day they moved all of the vehicles out to the Shrine Auditorium.
Okay.
And they had the show the next day.
No way.
So imagine a $17 million fire happening at a show.
Right.
And then, let's just move everything to another place next day.
Well, and even the Shrine's right down the street from AAA's home office. So I'm sure that was not a coincidence.
No, and they probably were all kind of tied in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously a lot of these auto shows, everything also in multiple other countries still go on till, to this day.
Oh yeah.
But of course during World War II, there were none of these auto shows.
Right.
1941, usually they've always seemed to be held in the fall. So
yeah. New model years coming out.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously 1941 December
right
was Pearl Harbor, and so boom, from then on till pretty much about like 1950 51, no auto shows because we were at war, and Detroit was making tanks and airplanes.
Yeah, right.
They weren't making cars.
Yes.
So it took a while for everything to get caught back up, but when we start diving into the more custom stuff, 1950, I mean, that was, like I said, all the auto shows came back, and then some of the more historic shows that, we consider car shows.
There you go.
Those all popped up around that time, too.
There you go. Well, so you're talking about probably like the two crown jewels. You're talking probably the Grand National Roadster Show, which originally was in Oakland. Mm-hmm. And then you're probably also talking about the Detroit Autorama.
Yeah, that, and then also, there is some custom stuff, but it's some maybe more higher end. But the Concours d'Elegance.
Oh, true that.
Pebble Beach, that was 1950.
Was it 50?
Yep.
Okay.
So that's when it started. So basically, we can say, 1950, all right, everyone's getting back into cars.
Right.
And this is obviously when hot rodding really starts to come into its own.
You're talking post-war times. Yeah. You got guys coming home that were thrill pilots that, were flying a Mustang that all of a sudden want to drive a 32 on the dry lakes.
Yeah.
So that's totally one and the same.
Same thing, too. A lot of them obviously learned how to become mechanics.
Right.
And work on motorcycles or work on all this equipment. So, okay, well, let me go pick something up and do it myself. And obviously that's, I know we'll get into that and tell that whole story of how hot rodding came about, but that's the basics of it.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk about the GNRS, or what was, originally the Oakland Roadster Show.
Yeah.
Like we mentioned, now we know it as the Grand National Roadster Show that's, held at the Pomona Fairplex for, I want to say at least the last 20 years.
Yeah, almost 20 years. Yeah, 2004.
Okay.
20 years.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But, that originated up there in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's, an event promoter named Al Schloneker that was the one that really was kind of the driving force that got the event started.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's the other part of the trophy because the Grand National Roadster Show was known for America's most beautiful roadster. Yeah. Because again, too, post-war, a lot of roadsters were being built.
That's what people were doing. Everything else
popular,
was new.
Yeah.
A 55 Bel Air, a whatever, that was new.
Right.
People weren't doing the full custom hot rodding stuff to it. They were doing that to something that was old and no one cared about.
Yeah. So it wasn't until, I want to say, the mid-70s when the Schloneker actually was a trophy that was brought to the show that was for, and they did have another trophy for a while from, I believe, like 1956 to like 71. They had a trophy for everything else.
There was, it was the best of show basically.
Right.
And they kind of officially split it in 74.
Yeah, because everybody that like you said, the guy that came in a few years later with a 55 Chevy, or like, the guys like Winfield and Barris and those guys are going to bring in what they're building. They weren't building roadsters all the time.
Yeah, you have all the 50s and 60s customs.
Yeah.
That weren't pre-37.
Right.
Were not a roadster.
Yeah.
Most of them were all, chop top and sectioned and all that, and had probably maybe more work in them than a hot rod, but didn't qualify. And then, in the last few years, they've kind of really, John Buck, Kevin Doyle, those guys, even Steve Strope is one of the judges. They've really tried to push the Schloneker Award back in as like basically the same level
Exactly.
as the America's Most Beautiful Roadster, to kind of bring that off and obviously, the last few winners of that, we had was a Buick Invicta, a 58 or 9 Impala, and a 30s, coupe, though,
right.
not a Roadster,
right?
That Troy Ladd and Hollywood Hot Rods did.
Well, and that also confuses a lot of people too, because for example, like let's talk about the Vern Luce coupe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a coupe, not a Roadster.
Yeah.
So it won the Schlonaker, but it's never won, obviously.
Yeah, you can't win
and
Beautiful Roadster, but the Jamie Musselman
right. So
Roadster,
Now the backstory on that one is that obviously they brought the Vern Luce coupe out, and at the time they, after they won the Schlonaker, they said, if you guys want to cut the roof off and bring it back next year, you can probably go for the AMBR. And Boyd basically did a hold my beer.
Yeah.
Got a hold of Jamie Musselman.
Yeah.
And said, we're going to build a coupe that looks like Vern's.
We're going to build a Roadster
that looks like that.
Yeah.
And obviously then, he wins the AMBR.
Yeah.
So
that's basically saying, hey, probably jokingly, if you cut the roof off, you'll win Roadster.
Right. Oh, yeah?
All right, cool. Let's do it.
So, and there's been a couple big name builders, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, because this is the show, well, it's the granddaddy of them all. It's been going on since 1950. They've been handing out an award for more than 70 years for the best vehicle and show.
Yeah.
So you're going to have your Andy Brizios, you're going to have your Boyd Coddingtons, you're going to have your Chip Fooses, your Troy Tapaniers, all of those
Troy
names.
Ladd, even early on, we're talking, Richard Peters, the a la carte,
They won twice.
So talk a little bit of that, because I know some of the rules with that and the judging's changed over the years, and we'll get into that. But it's not allowed to be shown previously.
Prior, right?
So it's can't debut at SEMA and then
yes.
Go into competition
right.
For America's Most Beautiful Roadster. But how would it win twice then?
The only thing I can think of is that at that time, the competition, because you got to remember, the people that built that car, right? Richard Peters was, and Blackie Jijian up there in Fresno, those guys were the go-to chassis guys of the day. That's where you had the, Winfields and the Barris and the Watsons. Those guys were painters.
Yeah. Yeah. They were more the finishers, not
right. And guys like Blackie and Richard Peters, they were racers. They drove dirt tracks. Blackie was the guy of Clovis Speedway for like decades that ran the dirt track, and he was a 5-time dirt track champion. So those guys brought the engineering to it, but Barris, they brought the style, and you look at Ed Roth was on that car. I mean, Ed Roth actually painted a la carte. So you got to look at, you've got like the Hall of Fame of builders that come into this one vehicle. Yeah. That just is time. If you look at the a la carte, it's timeless. That's the one thing.
No, and it still looks good. It doesn't look, I mean, you could get into some of the later, younger brother George Barris stuff that's very out there and obviously was meant for a lot of Hollywood stuff. But it still is a good looking car.
Tasteful.
Just done right. Yeah.
Maybe
they changed it up, or back then, I mean, we get in and we'll get into, the truck shows later, but like Grand National Truck Show, which just started kind of the sister show for trucks, being that it's just starting now on a little bit smaller scale, it was okay if something had been shown somewhere else prior to entering for that, America's Most Beautiful Truck. So maybe at that time, this is late 50s, this is only, 8-9 years into the show. Yeah. It was okay if it was shown somewhere else because your pool was smaller.
Yeah, exactly. So. Right. For as many people want to think that the 50s were an explosion, it's just, yes, there was an explosion of builders, but at the time
you got to look at scale.
Yeah,
you got to look at scale of compared now to then.
Yeah.
But yeah, obviously, about 20 years ago, it was purchased. John Buck.
Yes.
He moved it down to Pomona. He also runs Sacramento Autorama.
Right.
And I think he did or was doing stuff with Blackie's after Blackie had passed away.
Well, while he was still alive, right. And then, there was a family decision to end the Autorama. Yeah. Which we should probably talk about the Detroit Autorama first, because that also is the other crown jewel. But yeah, John Buck actually, it comes from that kind of same Central Cal, place where you have guys like Blackie Jijian, and even too, we'll get into Gary Metters later on about him and Goodguys. He's another CenCal guy. So,
well, and that's what's kind of interesting, and we'll get on all that. But we look at Southern California as the birth of hot rodding,
correct,
and the industry. A lot of the companies are. If you look at the birth of car shows, they're all Central and Northern California.
That's right.
So it's kind of interesting. Which maybe out here you had guys that were going racing more. Which obviously you did up there too. Obviously, we're talking about Blackie, but there's more racing out here.
There was at the time.
At the time.
Right.
So maybe, okay, we'll do shows, or weather's maybe not as nice, so it's an indoor show.
Well, car clubs also they got that from like the military. The whole band of brothers,
yeah.
I'm here with my guys, so everyone kind of had their own car club back in the early or late 40s, early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually even too how like Detroit Autorama came around, is that a bunch of hot rodders from the state of Michigan around Detroit,
yeah,
and we're talking like royalty. We're talking like Road Kings, Spark Plugs, Road Chariot. Those guys are like the OG of car clubs.
Yeah.
And they started, their own, the Michigan Hot Rod Association, so the MHRA.
Yeah, not the national.
Not the national one, but, the Michigan one.
Yeah.
And their whole idea was they were trying to get, these clubs were coming together to try to raise money to combat the street racing problem that was going on at the time. So they were also trying to go legit, which seems like kind of like what we're trying to do, nowadays is with sideshows, right?
Yeah. It's the same story of everything, everyone wants to, you're going out on the street, just doing what you can do, and then take some people to try to organize, raise money, and turn it into something safe, legitimate that can grow.
Now, so these guys, they started obviously the Detroit Autorama, and the first show I want to say was at University of Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
It was like 1953ish.
Yeah,
might be
1953,
okay.
and there was about 40 cars.
Yeah.
So
it wasn't like
small show.
Yeah, small show. I know most people when you say Detroit Autorama, they're going to think of two things. One, drag racing is a big deal with them, because even the MHRA, they bought a drag strip in the mid 50s.
Motor City Dragway.
Motor City Dragway, yeah. And that was a big deal. Obviously, that was your Detroit Dragway, and obviously most of your famous muscle cars were at Motor City. Then also they also got into they hired people. They hired entertainment. They made it more of a family show. Think more like a family pickup that featured cars.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the blueprint. I look at that as like, how did car shows that we know of today, you look back at Autorama.
No, and that's true, and they even, kind of very organized, the, judging, the, aspect of it. It was a, multi-day show. And yeah, it was kind of like a state fair kind of car show, if you will.
They had popular music.
Yeah.
They had, and I take that back. At first, really, it was about the cars, because it was, again, too, a lot of motorhead guys just trying to raise money to get,
and it's Detroit,
and it was Detroit.
Yeah.
And then you look at a guy like in walks in Don Riddler, who was a local promoter at the time, had a few musical acts, and also was a hot rodder. And so they kind of hired him to hire people and hire staff to help out with the show. I kind of believe that was like the late 50s. Because he did it for 4 or 5 years.
1956 is when.
Is that when they hired him?
When he started, and he passed away in 1963.
Right.
Which kind of then turned into the Don Riddler Memorial Award for the best of show, which we just call the Riddler Award.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of set the standard, though. That was when those guys, too, they had been working with guys, again, Al Schloneker and those guys for a points deal, because everybody had kind of a little bit of a different way of judging cars. Yeah. And what the MHRA wanted to do is set up a standard of rules. Now, you don't really get into that until about the 70s is when they really kind of started to I don't want to say unionize, but kind of band together and form the ISCA.
Yeah, ISCA, which is not, I've found this out, is not the Irish Setters Club of America.
No.
Because I started looking up the rules and stuff, and then I'm like, wait
a second.
These rules don't, and I looked at the URL, and so,
okay.
Dog competitions, hot rod competitions.
Yeah.
But yeah, and ISCA is very, obviously, it's progressed for 40 years or something, 50 years, but they're very strict on, here's all the classifications. They've broken down, classes, number of modifications considered for each class.
Right.
And maybe we should get into that a little bit, because we're going to be talking about the Riddler Award and the Grade 8 and what's kind of, that Schloneker and America's Most Beautiful Roadster, kind of like the top tier, awards that people go for and build cars specifically to go after.
Exactly.
So with the judging, they look at obviously body, paint, interior, engine, undercarriage, and then the last one is like overall detail, cleanliness, safety,
right?
Like all things
engineering
together.
stuff.
Engineering,
Yeah.
yeah. So kind of like all your details, all the other stuff that aren't the main things.
Right.
And so, in the custom categories, they've got obviously mild, semi, full, and then radical.
Okay.
And what's kind of interesting about that is, so mild would be 4 to 6 modifications.
Sure.
And that could be, any type of, several, either, custom modification or mild changes,
Adding something.
add, 4 mild changes up, and that's counts as one modification,
Sure.
basically. So if you're adding something, or you're taking off part of a bumper or a door handle or whatever. So obviously that all keeps going. And if it's, full is like 10 plus modifications,
Right.
like you've custom painted, your interior is all custom. And that's the thing too, like, okay, so maybe your seats are considered a modification. Your dash is considered a modification.
Right.
Your door panel, like, it's not just, oh, you have a custom interior, that's one modification. They're counting everything.
Yeah.
And that's gotten a little bit into some trouble later on in the years, where people were building specifically for
Points.
those points,
Right.
and the number of modifications.
Yep.
And weren't necessarily taking style, subtlety, detail
Yes.
into account.
Right.
I've
I've shown against a few people like that before.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But so there's a radical class as well. And that basically is any modifications.
Right.
Doesn't matter the number. But it is basically either it's chopped, sectioned, or channeled.
Okay.
So you could have a 100% stock vehicle that's chopped or, channeled.
Yeah.
And it's radical.
Right.
And we saw the same thing, obviously in the truck world, where if you were body dropped, you're automatically in the radical class or the wild class.
Makes sense.
Doesn't matter whatever else you have.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of work, and
That's a radical modification.
Yes.
You deserve to be in the radical
It takes
class.
more than just a day to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a bolt-on. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's kind of what, the Riddler Award has become, and what people have gone after.
Right.
Is kind of the most innovative, high quality. I remember even hearing like no logos. Like if there was a company logo on the steering wheel, you had to machine it off.
Right.
If you had tire, people were taking tires, milling off the lettering
Yes.
on the sides of the walls of the tire, so that there was nothing
It's just
on
a
there.
clean tire. Right. And that also has to do a lot to aesthetics, though. People want,
Sure.
they don't want something to catch their eye, so they want everything to be smooth and just, less is more.
Yeah.
But I know
But sometimes
what you're saying.
it's become
sometimes
more is more.
Yeah, right. And even judging some of those cars, they're pulling door panels to see down the inside of the window sash to see if the backside of the sheet metal's been painted.
Yeah.
So, again, too, if you want your car put under a microscope,
Go to one of those shows.
go to one of those shows, right?
And I was researching, a few examples basically, and I don't think it was like an official competition, but a guy had written an article of talking to one of these judges, like, okay, hey, here's my, Mustang that I'll drag race and street car, and it's nice. How would you judge it?
Right.
And it's like, okay, hey, you've got a nice car. Okay, now this guy then starts going into, well, you've got some thread coming off of the SFI certification tag on your harness.
Right.
So that's a point.
Right.
You've got like,
Yeah.
you're just, it's,
So if you're
it's
ADD
just
like
going.
to the 10th power, that is your job. Right. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And they'll go under with mirrors.
Yeah.
And display
Right.
also came into it,
Yeah.
where that would be some points for your display. And then there was, with the ISCA, there was, certain rules of what you could show or what could be in your display. And it's kind of grown since then, and people will kind of play the game a little bit to
There's some politics
try
to this. Yes.
to get, the vehicle to basically, a judge's satisfaction,
Right.
kind of building it specifically for that,
Right.
which kind of sometimes can take away from either the vehicle or just what kind of it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, when you're going for the top crown, piece of what you exist for, like, of your vehicle or of any vehicle, and you want to be that top guy, then you have to play this game.
Yeah. No, and that's, the amount of money that, and time that go into a lot of these builds. We personally, Mike Filion from Pro Design, Jeff Hess with the old sled, I was 7-8 year process. I'm not going to call them out on how much it cost, but it is a lot.
Major investment. Yes.
A investment
Yes.
is the key. And they've toured around, they've done the circuits. There's also with the ICA judges, they have, different shows and different circuits and autoramas throughout, and World of Wheels, throughout the country that you can rack points up, and depending on how many you go to. So yeah, there's a game if you want to play it for it. But at the end of the day, it's bringing a really cool vehicle out to a car show.
Well, the other thing too, and both of the Crown Jewel shows, they do a lot. I mean, for example, Detroit Autorama, they have the D-Lot auction. Which started out as, again, they were just trying to auction off, a vehicle to help out Make-A-Wish.
I was going to say, yeah, they're doing it for charity.
Right, yeah. I think Murray Pfaff is the guy that heads that. But they've been doing it for like the last 10 or 12 years now. And there's been some major people that have got involved with it. And every year they're building cars and also products that they're auctioning off. The proceeds do go to Make-A-Wish. And it's something that just started out of the parking lot at the Cobb Center.
Yeah, and which is kind of interesting if you've ever been to the Cobo Center. That's usually March, February, and
freezing.
It's snow.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, when I went there about 10 years ago, it was snowing.
But see, that's what's funny too.
So.
Like you mentioned, the auto shows being
indoors and stuff.
Indoors in fall. Then you look at these shows because GNRS is usually the end
February,
of February,
January,
right? Or January, February, and then you've got Detroit. That's usually end of February, beginning of March. So it's like the precursor to the year, I guess.
Well, and I think maybe that's a little bit too, depends on location. Pomona Fairgrounds, let's just say, just using that as an example, throughout the rest of the year, you'll have the Pomona Fair.
Right.
You'll have other events in the summertime or in the fall so you're not, that's the only time you can do it.
That's right.
And it's an indoor show, so you're not completely worrying about weather. And maybe when it's nice weather outside, guys don't want to go into a building. They want to cruise their car. They want to show it off and drive it.
Right.
So we see a lot more outdoor shows later in the year. That's kind of been fairly consistent.
Sure. Well, let's not leave out Black EGGian's Autorama too, because that's another show that was on the West Coast. Obviously, him being from the Fresno, Clovis area,
Central Cal.
Central Cal there, and I mean that show lasted 51 years.
Yeah.
And again too was not something to shake a stick at. You had all of the big names always attending his show, and he himself was a legend. He won the AMBR. He won. Mm-hmm. He won the AMBR himself. He won it with the Barris brothers and also with
Richard Peters.
Yeah. But then also too, he set up a lot of these guys. Andy Brizio always talks about his show his motivation being from the Autoramas from the Fresno times. So he's somebody that we don't want to leave out of history, because most of these guys too, like your Boyd Coddingtons, they would go to that show. And
that's what helped. Yeah. And winning those shows is kind of what helped either launch or cement or, gain notoriety for a lot of these builders.
Right.
Where, now you've just built a car that won the most prestigious award. Well, you're going to get phone calls, the next day of guys asking them to build their car. So it all kind of helps the industry grow and come. And obviously too, there's other aspects than just the car show, like we mentioned with the Detroit Autorama of the D-Lot auction, the music, stuff like that. But a lot of times there's like for the kids, a model, car show definitely. Section.
Yes.
Obviously you've got all the vendors, exhibitors,
right.
And these different activities.
Well, and these were the shows that brought that in. I mean, they would even have see the James Dean death car,
and that's true too. You'd get a lot of, autograph signing sessions from, movie stars or, I remember it's always fun, like, hey, see the Dukes of Hazzard, or the kit car and stuff like that.
Right.
So it was just, just putting everything into it to kind of make it a good experience.
True that.
And there was a lot more shows that started to pop up too in Southern California now.
Right.
We're looking at, Oakland, Detroit, Fresno. But the RG Canning era of shows started to happen around a little bit later, but kind of as a lot of these started to grow.
Yeah.
Those shows started to come into place in LA.
Right. And I mean, Gary Canning was just an event promoter. He wasn't that it was a car show guy, but he was just an event promoter.
Yeah.
And he did though, right place at the right time because he came in at the mid 60s when shows like GNRS were big.
Yeah.
And
So there's a template and
and there wasn't a lot of competition around for him. So he started holding these shows and doing that. And he would, again, get the big names because a lot of the big name guys were located in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I go back to Black EGGN again, just talking about he was the first guy to place mirrors underneath his car to get more points.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is we talked about how, especially with, the Riddler war where you'd have judges, on their backs with a pen light and dissecting everything. But it's a lot easier to see, okay, we chromed some parts on the undercarriage or we painted the frame or something like that. If you've got some mirrors, there, and then obviously, the displays and stuff, a lot of guys would kind of further keep that going beyond just mirrors. You set up some lights.
Oh yeah.
I remember like the import years would put like cotton for clouds, like it was doing a burnout.
Oh yeah. And that goes back to the 50s.
That's true too. Yeah, I think maybe the reason why I remember that is it being funny is that I remember seeing one time at one of the import shows a front wheel drive car with cotton coming out the back.
Okay, but see, because you got it wrong though. They got it wrong though too.
No, I'm saying they got it wrong.
Yeah, they got it wrong. And the other thing too is that idea was that their car was on a cloud from the 50s. Right?
Okay.
It wasn't that I was doing a burnout.
Okay.
It was that here we are. I'm uplifting this car on this pedal of this bed of clouds. Right?
Yeah.
It was just and it was mattress.
Ideas,
it was mattress
something.
batting is what that was. That you buy it from a roll from downtown.
Yeah.
Downtown LA, the garment district, and you could stuff that in there. Now the other thing too is my dad would tell me that was a way to hide all your mistakes on a street car.
That's
you would
probably
stuff
true.
the fender wells in there because you might have had not as clean car, right? So
or maybe you use some tricks of the lighting and how it kind of goes to either highlight something a little bit better or hide something. Yeah, I mean, there's always little tricks, and there's always kind of a lot of times your some standards for your displays would be, and a lot of times people would custom paint them or something like that. Sure. But to your oil can.
Oh, your gas,
water
oil,
can,
and water. Yeah.
Gas, oil, water.
Yeah, had to have that.
Maybe a jack,
right?
There. So
that was color coded to your vehicle or your display.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, again, too, that was just they got into the diorama style of display, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that was a way of showing your uniqueness, not just for your vehicle, but also like how do you see this vehicle? Do you see it dancing on a bed of clouds or being uplifted on a magic carpet, or do you see it doing a reverse burnout?
Yeah, maybe that's what they were doing. They were going in reverse or something. I don't know, but no, and that's obviously that did add to some of the points, but it also just aesthetics and creativity, another way of showing it off and all of that.
Well, RG Canning was the place for that. I mean, they were spectacle shows. They usually either the LA Sports Arena, which is where the Clippers played for a while for you LA people, but then also too, Long Beach Sports Arena was also the other place.
Yeah.
Which, these things they would hold probably 400 to 500 cars and would see about 30 to 40,000 people throughout a weekend.
Yeah, so they're big.
They were big shows.
Events,
yeah, and they were advertised on the televisions, on the radios. You'd hear about them coming for weeks and weeks.
Billboards and everything.
Yeah, and RG Canning himself, or Gary, he formed a partnership and started.
Yeah, so what is the RG Canning?
Well, it's his initials because
okay.
Gary, I forget his middle name, but Canning is his name. So RG Canning it's his name.
Yeah. So maybe his first name was Robert. Or
probably
something
like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he also formed the Rose Bowl swap meet is what he's most known for. Mm-hmm. That's still to this day you can go see. Cameron Diaz, shopping for lampshades. Mm-hmm. But it's still a big deal. But the other important thing at RG Canning is the people that came out of RG Canning, because somebody close to us, Bob Hayes, worked for them for a long time.
Yeah.
And you'll see a lot of kind of some of his shows and some of the things that he got from the RG Canning stuff in his shows.
Yeah. And that's more of the mini truck shows.
Exactly.
So we'll definitely be diving in more with him.
But also too is the father of Supercross is the other deal that's,
the Mickey Thompson and Mike Goodwin
because Mike Goodwin worked for RG Canning and had the idea to rent out the Coliseum, which again too, he got that from them renting out the Rose Bowl. And Gary didn't see eye to eye on what Mike did. So Mike sought out another investor, and boom, Supercross was born. Mm-hmm. So it was actually called the Super Bowl of Motocross, and it was held at the LA Coliseum.
And then maybe they couldn't use the Super Bowl name because at least we know now, and we might have to bleep this because you're not allowed to say Super Bowl.
Well, the big game.
The Sunday game that was very recent.
Right. That's usually in February. Yes. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they actually file an injunction, and he started calling it Supercross.
Yeah.
So,
no, and that's, you know, and of course, Mike Goodwin also then didn't see eye to eye necessarily with Mickey Thompson.
right.
He's currently in prison.
Yes.
You know, for their deaths, but that's getting a little bit.
Yeah.
That'd be good something to talk about in another
Right.
history episode. But that's, you know, just showing a lot of the shows that were becoming the large kind of conventions. You did have some smaller scale, you know, shows that popped up that, you know, we're getting into the 70s. You're talking about lowrider shows, but also with that was a lot of the Volkswagen.
Oh, yeah.
You know, kind of bug guys.
Yeah.
That were kind of a little bit of a different.
Oh,
you know,
they were the kids that weren't picked for softball.
Yeah.
I mean, they were like
they couldn't get into the other shows. Well, let's just do our own.
Yeah. And Rich Kimball's kind of I'm going to say he's probably the Pied Piper out of this deal. And Bug-In started at Orange County International Raceway, which was in Irvine, California, which was before Irvine, California. They actually ended this racetrack to form Irvine, California. But, you know, it was on the Irvine Ranch, and it was a very successful, very, you know, internationally known on ABC Wide World of Sports and all that stuff. The Snake and Mongoose would race at OCIR all the time. Yeah, I said that right. Haven't said that for a long time. It's OCIR.
Yes, because it's international.
International.
Yes.
You know, so they started there, and it was kind of made sense because that was the bug explosion came from Southern California.
Yeah,
it was 100%.
And it was Orange County. You know, LA at some point too, but
even Riverside, because you got EMPI, which is Engineered Motor Parts International, and EMPI was the first aftermarket company that made parts for Volkswagens. And they were out of actually a Volkswagen dealership in Riverside that's called Econo Motors, or it was called Econo Motors. So that's kind of where that started. And they started drag racing because obviously drag racing throughout the 60s, speed contest was still a big deal.
Yeah.
And, you know, your 4-cylinder German car is not going to beat my American V8. So
let's just do it with each other.
Well, exactly.
Basically.
You know, so they were kind of the stepchildren for a little bit here. And but their shows were big. Their shows were
and they
wild.
created their own style.
Yeah.
And, you know, we even know the story a little bit of like, TMI products. They got their start in, you know,
Volkswagens
and Volkswagen's interior. And the first, you know, event that they sold their door panels at was a Bug-In.
Exactly.
You know, and they basically sold out of everything. They're like, all right, well, we're out. This works, you know, that we can keep doing this.
So I think the first Bug-In might be 68.
Yeah, 1968.
And it went until I know they closed OCIR in 83. So I think they did, because I remember this.
Well, and that's 83 was when TMI started,
right.
So they would have.
But the math doesn't add up in that year because they did 31 Bug-Ins, but 68 to 83 is not 31.
But they might have.
They did multiples.
Yeah,
they
did a spring or something.
They would do a spring and they would do a fall event.
Yeah.
So, and they tried to get the Bug-In thing started again in the late 80s, where there was it was actually called Lion Country Safari that ended up, it was exactly what it was, a Lion Country Safari, right? And then in the parking lot of that, they tried to set up another area that was very close to OCIR. It was actually across the freeway, which then Lion Country Safari turned into Irvine Meadows, which now is houses.
Yeah, because then it was, amphitheater.
The Verizon Amphitheater.
Yeah,
and
5 Point. And
So there is that. But, you know, racetracks aren't the only thing that get torn down, so...
Yeah, but related things
things do.
Basically anything that's large open plots of land
if
in
it's
a
Irvine,
very
it's
desirable area.
Yes, Irvine is
houses
the enemy
go
of
there.
fun.
But no, and that's so you had a lot of the Volkswagens. You know, a lot of the obviously low riding had been very popular, but 70s was really kind of the early heyday of low riding. But yeah, there was a lot of crackdowns on the cruising.
Right,
you know, people would cruise Hollywood, Sunset, Whittier Boulevard. You know, obviously Van Nuys had a lot of cruising.
Right.
And yeah, especially with the lowrider guys, police did start to crack down, and even the state of California banned cruising.
Yes.
You know, until technically last year,
Yeah.
which is kind of like, wait a second, I've done tons of cruising.
Right.
And
never knew I was breaking the law.
Yeah. But
takes away from the fun of it, right?
True. Yeah. Now I don't go cruising because it's perfectly legal.
Right.
But no, and that's, you know, to go back to the Northern California deal.
Yeah.
The first national lowrider show took place in San Jose.
That's right.
And that was organized, you know, by the founder of Lowrider magazine that was also started in San Jose, Al Lopez.
Right.
And that, it was the following year is when they started that. And I know we've talked a little bit where there was, a couple other shows or maybe locations where it was happening at that time.
Because my dad lived in the Bay Area, and I would visit him often throughout, the years growing up. And, even then too, he lived in Cupertino, which is a sister city to San Jose. So the low riding experience,
everyone would know that is Apple now.
Yeah, now it's
basically
Apple, right?
It's Apple City. Yeah.
But he, so he lived there, and my brothers and I, we would see all the lowriders, and we kind of thought those were kind of cool because obviously you see hop in car, something like that, something that looked different.
Yeah, and it was different than the muscle car that you probably saw, or the classic car, or the hot rod.
Right.
Yeah.
So
a little more flashy.
I can remember lowrider shows being at the Cow Palace, and I remember that vividly through just hearing the commercials.
Yeah.
Because you'd have like the war lowrider music in the background, and the guy like, "Hey, come down to the Cow Palace," that kind of thing. Like you were just like,
it was instead of like Sunday, it was
just
low,
low
rider.
Right. So I totally remember those commercials on the radio, and I want to say there was a TV commercial, but I've looked online for anything out of the Cow Palace, and it's maybe just a forgotten memory.
I know there was later shows and even more recent shows of Lowrider, like in Paula's magazine show, and stuff like that being held there. But we couldn't really find anything of that era of it. But
then you look at the other mecca of low riding, you look at Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's if you're gonna. It's kind of like Surf City. Huntington Beach and Santa Cruz always fight over the name Surf City. Yeah. Well, San Jose and Albuquerque are always doing the same thing. You look at what their shows were doing too, and they're in like horse stalls, like in rodeo areas, and they're doing lowrider shows. Mm-hmm. So it just goes to show you. I mean, it's
usually always a convention center or a fairgrounds or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's obviously that kind of, and it was called the National Lowrider Show was the name of that. Obviously kind of that you can maybe trace the lineage to then what we know as, the Lowrider Super Show,
right?
The LA Super Show. And then, in the last few years, even with Lowrider Magazine going away, there was still the Lowrider Magazine events, and the Super Shows. And then they've started to license out basically that name so that there's, multiple Lowrider shows throughout the country.
Right.
And I think right now they're doing what they call the Legacy Tour. So there's like a dozen lowrider shows, sanctioned lowrider shows throughout the country. And that a lot of the same, similar judging to maybe the RG Canning shows. Absolutely. And some other stuff applied.
Right.
And they even, I remember, hearing that, okay, whatever's winning, best lowrider or something. Yeah. You couldn't bring it back for competition the next year,
right?
Unless you had changed like
25%.
25%.
Yeah.
Which, and you could probably break that down and go, okay, well, 25%. If I do, different door panels, that's maybe 5%. Like you could.
That's why you look at an evolving lowrider paint job is I can add more tape fades here to give this another candy color, and the car will look different. Yeah. Or I can just recandy this section
different
to make it dark, and I'll
put
change
some
the
engraving
wheels
here.
Right.
Yeah,
so that's kind of the evolution,
and that's good because you want something new. Yeah. If something's
you want it
built,
to evolve.
Yeah, and if something's built and it's that high of a quality and craftsmanship and all that stuff, okay, you bring it back the next year. Yeah, it might win again.
Right.
And then it's just like, all right, what are we doing here?
Well,
so that keeps bringing new people in, new vehicles in, and stuff like that.
It does. And it's also not fun when a guy wins like everything for like 5 years. And you're just kind of like, well, I don't even want to compete because he's just going to beat me.
Yeah.
And now at least he's got to work to beat you.
Yeah.
So.
And that's what, a lot of the other shows that we mentioned, on the more hot riding side, it was, you couldn't compete unless it hadn't been shown before.
Right.
Obviously, Lowrider one was a little different where you can't compete again unless it's dramatically changed.
Exactly. So. And you have some legacy cars. Like, I mean, 2 cars stand out in my mind right now. Las Vegas, which is a Lincoln Mark
4 or 5,
whatever it is.
No, it's probably a 6.
A 6 or a 7.
6.
And then you have the Penthouse car, and which is a glass house, Chevrolet Caprice, that kind of thing. But those 2 cars from the 70s into the 80s, into the 90s, and even into the 2000s, those are legacy cars. That's something that, a Gypsy Rose is another one that's just constantly, whenever that car shows up, it doesn't have to change because it was already so far over the top.
Yeah, and that's sometimes where with some of those cars, you don't want to change it because they've become iconic
Yes.
in their current state. So now it's about preserving that versus continually changing and competing. Yeah. And, there's been issues, with some of that. It took a long time for, the Lowrider show to come back to the LA Convention Center into LA.
Blame it on Ice Cube.
And that's, 1992, there was a large, gang fight.
Yeah.
One person was killed there.
Yeah.
Cops came in, shut the whole thing down. And, there was, this was a month, not even a month, but a couple weeks after the LA riots.
Yes.
So everyone was still very,
yes,
on edge or very, kind of tight about certain things of that going on. So, it's had its waves, with the LA shows, but there was also, several other shows that kind of came out of that, if you will. Some smaller scale shows like the Azalea Park show.
Yeah.
And that was, put on by a friend of ours, Father Terry McWeeny.
That's correct.
And he was a Southgate police detective.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it, okay, well, rather than going after these guys, and what happened, let me kind of help and coordinate and control, if you will, give them a location and a fun day to show it off and not have issues.
It was also about community.
Yeah.
That's what Terry was really after. Terry was after the fact that, he might have pulled over some of these kids, out there messing around and doing stuff, but he saw that, I don't have any place to do this.
Yeah.
So sure, if we
they're
set this
going to
up,
do it on the street or they'll do it.
And of course, in that fashion, the community came out. They brought their barbecues and they brought their, families, and they made it a day, and they made it more about just communities getting together. And Terry's major thing was, don't mess around in here.
Yeah.
And everybody respected that, and Terry ran that show for 18 years without an incident.
Yeah. No, and that's, so you're talking about, okay, while there was incidents at the Lowrider super shows and Lowrider shows, you didn't have it at that kind of a show. And to me, that obviously there is the super shows, but to me, like, the perfect Lowrider show is that atmosphere where it's at a park or a location where people are barbecuing, hanging out, their kids are playing.
Just a Sunday afternoon.
There's a hop off, competition going off. And it's
and you still want to roll the lot. You still want to roll that lot and let everybody see your car. So,
you got to cruise low and slow.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the shows started to include a cruising aspect of it,
right?
Where it wasn't just sit in a chair, like, I mean, that was kind of the joke of like a hot rod show or a cruise night of like, okay, I parked my car, I cleaned it, got out my folding camping chair, and I'm sitting behind my car the entire time.
Right. Waiting for questions.
Waiting for people to talk about it. And that's cool for some people, but a lot of times, get into more activity. And that's kind of what, seen, if you look at a lot of the early hot rod shows, some of the lowrider shows, a lot of those were, indoor, set up, a display.
Stagnant display.
Yeah, stagnant. And then kind of the next era, I guess you could say, of the car shows, and a lot of those continued, but were where there was more activity with the vehicle.
The fairground cruises.
Some of your competitions within.
Right.
There was a car show, but there was also, drag racing, or drifting, or something
stereo
like that.
Competition.
Stereo.
Right.
Yeah, there's always some more activities to it.
Yeah. And that kind of came from mainly most of these car shows were put on at county fairs, state fairs, large parking lots that had either some type of horse area that you could drive around the entire area. So they were kind of set
the
up.
Fairgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they were set up as fairgrounds, right? So they were mostly paved. They weren't dirt roads. They were enclosed, so you could have somebody drive around and not, drive in and out type of thing. And obviously the promoter wouldn't make money, but also safety reasons. So fairground cruising became a kind of a big deal. The people I kind of come to the first that I think of are the Moore family that put on the Great Labor Day cruise from, the early 70s. I want to say 73-ish. To only a few years ago, that was at the Orange County Fairgrounds. And the reason why I think they're the most important one to talk about is that they kind of set the blueprint up where other people kind of took that stamp and continued on with that.
That kind of style show. If we look at the Grand National Roadster Show, Detroit Autorama, Blackie's, Fresno Autorama.
The RG Cannings,
that kind of was the template and the blueprint for that style of a show,
Right.
which we still see today, still see with some of the World of Wheels type
there you go.
shows and stuff like that. Okay, then yeah, the Great Labor Day Cruise and, you know, Goodguys shows that came out of that kind of helped set the standard and blueprint for those fairground cruising type shows.
Right. And Gary Metters actually worked for the Moors for a time or two, and you know, kind of learned what the deal was and implemented what they were doing in Southern California up in Pleasanton, California, which is,
like we say, Northern California
it's
again.
Northern California again, right? You know, and he was kind of the top. That's kind of the top of Central California, almost into like the San Jose areas where Pleasanton's at. So he knew that he could pull people from the other side of the hill to come in, but also to all the wealthy farmers, those guys. Well, they'll come up and also show off. So Pleasanton made a lot of sense, and I don't know if he really did. For the first couple of years, he only really did the show in Pleasanton. I think it was a while until he went out of California.
Yeah. So 83 was the first Pleasanton show, and it was a one-day show.
Yeah.
It's Pleasanton Goodguys still is a all-American, all-year show.
Right.
But that's what it was, the very first show. And then 87 was the first one outside of California.
Okay.
And now we've got, you know, a dozen across the country.
There's 20 or something like that. 22.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
And some of the rules or what kind of they do have changed, and it depends on where it's at.
Yeah.
You know, and with the Goodguys show, it started out kind of like saying coming that model of cruising from, you know, the Labor Day cruise.
Yeah.
They've tried to add some more events to it throughout the years, because obviously it went from a one-day show to a 3-day show.
Right.
You know, they'll do like the All-American Sunday, which is open to everybody, you know, with American vehicle or even a American powered vehicle.
Right. Yeah.
Because sometimes you'll see, you know, some, like I remember seeing a Toyota Stout doing the Autocross, but it had an LS in it.
That's right.
You know.
That's right.
So, and that's what it, you know, the Autocross at Goodguys became a pretty big event.
Yeah, and that's what's fun about some of the events. Like, you know, Columbus is kind of the mecca show for the Autocross guys, whereas like, you know, Pleasanton obviously is the street rod one.
Yeah.
You know, so some of these
And
are
the custom
themed around, you know.
Well, and that's, and obviously with the awards, you know, they kind of do similar stuff, but then they'll do the truck of the year.
Right.
You know, hot rod of the year.
Yeah.
Custom of the year, custom d'elegance.
Yeah.
And they'll kind of key in on certain shows where it makes sense to kind of name those Street Machine would be at Columbus.
Yeah.
You know, truck of the year, you know, Texas? Or I think Scottsdale. Maybe they'll do one because they have an early
and a late.
Yeah. You know, custom d'elegance obviously is Pleasanton, and that's kind of is a little bit hub of your custom guys, your lowrider-ish guys, and
the Rick Dorr show.
The Rick Dorr show. Yeah. No, but the Autocross, you know, they've do that at I think every Goodguys show.
I think
now.
I want to say at every one of they do an Autocross, but with Columbus being the go-to show for the Autocross guys.
And then the final one is obviously the Scottsdale deal at the end of the year basically.
Yeah. And the Autocross thing I think is great. It's fun because you can just take a car from the cruise lane and drive through if you've never tried it before.
Yeah.
Or if you're like into it, there's competition there.
Yeah.
So,
no, and they've got like kind of the pro class.
Yeah.
They've got the truck, car, different kind of breakdowns of that. But there's been a lot of people, and there are some autocross competitions and events and stuff. But it kind of seems, at least for the autocross crowd, like that is kind of the series.
It's like a circuit.
Yeah.
It's almost like that's Columbus is a stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean it's very competitive racing there, all the way to the guy that brought his 66 Ford Mustang and wants to take it around to see how well he can do.
Mm-hmm.
So it is fun because it's in a smaller area, which obviously everybody wants to go to a much bigger area, but it being a smaller area, that also comes into how you need to, your strategy of how you're driving.
Yeah. It's different than a road course.
Right.
It's different. Usually probably, and obviously it depends on the event, depends on how they lay it out. But I remember it's always your lap time, if you will, is always around 40 seconds to maybe a minute and a half is like,
right.
That's, where you're at. So of course, that kind of helps them out maybe with safety because, you're
keeping the speed down.
You're not getting more than 40 miles an hour
Right.
or something. You're not, it's not a road course where you're going 120, 130.
Right.
It's, a little more safe, manageable. And it comes down to handling of on the suspension, your steering ability, it kind of removes certain things from the equation that most racing would have.
Yeah.
And it kind of maybe levels the playing field a little where, you're not needing 5 different things to compete at a certain level. You only need 2 or 3.
Yeah. And the other thing that's nice, being in a small area, you have spectators.
Yeah.
You don't have like a road course where you need binoculars to see the guy in the back, straight away. This is all right in your face, and it's right in the middle of a fairground, so a lot of people can kind of get in and get involved with it. So it is a draw, which kind of brings me to the next, I guess, versions of shows we should talk about, the festivals.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's, we talked about how the Autorama, your lowrider shows, like everything would have maybe a, something for the kids,
right?
Something, a musical kind of guest or a band playing. But yeah, there was shows like, the Dub Show, which turned into the Dub Tour, where you'd get top high-end artists.
Yeah.
You'd get whoever the most popular rapper or singer was, chances are they'd be headlining the Dub Show. And that kind of, a little bit of that style of vehicle and kind of crowd came a little bit from the lowrider world where, okay, your lowrider guys are on 13s and Daytons and set, a certain style, and has to be maybe it's an Impala or a Regal or something like that, where the Dub crowd was your Escalades, your higher end vehicles, your luxury vehicles that then had all the modifications done to it, that same as what you'd see at a hot rod show, just in that style.
Yeah. Well, and it represented a lifestyle. I mean, obviously the more younger urban style of living with big wheels, fancy cars, lavish
models,
luxury,
you're having
that kind of stuff, right?
A lot of models coming to hang out. You had obviously all the concert stuff of it, and also at that time too, you had like a lot of the import car scene that you'd have some street racing, you've had maybe your drifting events, but the import car shows, started to pop up in the late 90s as well.
Oh yeah.
Kind of around the similar time as the Dove show. And one of those like hot import nights.
Yeah. Completely different.
Hot import nights.
Right. Completely different.
You'd have cruise nights, those existed.
Sure.
But you didn't have a lot of shows at nighttime.
Right.
Outdoors.
Yeah.
Because you're showing off the car, so it's inside under lights, or it's in the morning and you got the sunlight. But it was essentially like, here's a nightclub, car show element.
Yep,
and that's kind of the blueprint for that.
But it's kind of funny how it kind of, to me, it took a lot from the RG Canning days, because even there was hot import nights. I was at the Long Beach Sports Arena, and they had a DJ. They had static displays of stuff. There wasn't like a lot of cruising stuff like that, but completely different vibe.
Yeah.
Completely not as much, let's say, from little toddler to adult families, more like families that were just into cars that went there that were already driving cars. So like,
so you're
a lot of
high school, older 20s. Yeah. That kind of,
you didn't see a lot of 4-year-olds running around hot import nights,
maybe not in the first few years,
first
maybe
few,
as people kind of got a little older and had
there's
families, but
and then look at
Nopi
how
Nationals,
Nopi kind of took both things, the Atlanta Motor Speedway.
Atlanta Motor Speedway.
My tongue is too big today. Atlanta Motor Speedway. Yeah. I mean, that was, a show that kind of took let's do the camp out thing, but let's also make it an import show. Mm-hmm. So, the import guys always had they kind of go back to the Volkswagen guys. They didn't really have the mainstream deal, so they just made their own. Yeah.
No, and that's, they weren't getting invited to the hot rod shows, so make their own version.
No problem with that.
And he's talking about Georgia and Atlanta. There's been a show in the last few years that's pretty crazy, draws a lot of money in.
Right.
But that'd be the Rick Ross, show is kind of what it's nicknamed, but it's essentially held at his house.
Right.
Which of course, when you've got, hundreds of acres probably and a mansion,
right.
You can do that.
Right.
No, and that's kind of geared more towards your donks, your high-end flashy cars, the luxury cars, basically that
your
whole
big
thing.
Wheel cars. Yeah.
Big wheel cars.
Right.
And the cost of entry is even just for a
Steep.
spectator is pretty high.
All right.
But that's that kind of group they're trying to attract, make it a VIP kind of experience.
Exactly.
And obviously, we call it like the bowling trophies, or the soccer team trophies, where it's just, hey, your local trophy shop, you buy awards from there.
Right.
That's progressed. A lot of guys were, then either would make their own awards, do plaques, do something a little bit special.
Right.
With that show, they'll do like a diamond encrusted gold key.
Yep.
With the Rolls Royce or the Rick Ross,
Yes.
Kind of logo on it. So it's like now you've got the golden key,
Yeah.
the diamond encrusted, blinged out key.
Right.
So it's just similar models
Yeah.
of all these car shows. It's just, okay, this is what this genre is into, the vibe that they like, what they see is fun.
Right.
And just diving in on that. And it's cool too, in my opinion, to go to a lot of these different shows because you're going to get different ideas.
You totally do.
You're going to see different vehicles.
Right.
A lot of them are going to be just as good of quality,
Yes.
just a different style.
Right. And that, I think that is so true and so important for us to mention to that is that car shows are there for the love of the car.
Yeah.
Whether that car is, a 32 Roadster or if it's a 78 Thunderbird, you got to appreciate that someone's put their time, their effort, all their blood, sweat, and tears to make that car what it is.
Yeah. And with that and those specific, kind of genres of certain car shows, you'll get where it is just, it's about the lifestyle, where, it's about, hot rod guys hanging out and, we call it the New Balance Nationals and
Yes.
stuff now, but, to the hopping with the lowrider shows and some of the different music genres with different shows. There's for a time and still a little bit going on, probably 20 years ago, you had like the rockabilly shows.
Right.
So it's kind of a throwback to the 1950s.
Definitely.
To kind of the early years of hot rodding, early years of rock and roll.
Right.
And you'd have your pinup competitions, versus a bikini competition at another car show.
Right.
Or you'd have your rockabilly bands that were playing, and so you had stuff like the Moon Eyes show. You had Ink and Iron, which was all lifestyle because it was here's a
Basically,
car show,
yeah.
a tattoo convention,
Right.
and a full blown concert.
Yes.
All in one with everything
Well,
else.
don't leave out Viva.
And then and Viva, Las Vegas, it's car show, but then there's concerts at night. There's you basically got to dress the part, look the part. And what's funny, I was looking at their website to see some of the things, and they're probably the main point that they make on it, aside from, hey, here's all the details.
Right.
No 17-inch or larger wheels allowed.
Hey, I called it out.
And that's what they're saying. Like,
Right.
basically,
Just-
hey, it's all got to be a certain
Yeah.
style, a certain era, a
Yeah.
certain look to it.
Well, that's not, let's look at the Race of Gentlemen,
Yeah.
right?
And there was
totally
a car
themed
show.
event.
Yeah. And there has been a car show element of the Race of Gentlemen.
Right.
Where they'll have, because that's, you're not, they have certain requirements for, 1948 and older engines,
Yeah.
1937 or something.
Something like that. Yeah.
Vehicles, same with the motorcycles and stuff like that.
Right.
But you got to remember is, hot rodding and racing existed in the 1910s, the 1920s.
Sure.
But it really started and really was big in the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah.
But you also had all the custom cars and certain motorcycles at the same time that were kind of intertwined, but you're not going to race a Merc on the beach.
No.
So they would have like the custom world, kind of event, with the car shows of the really nice, sleds and stuff like that, and racing on the beach.
It just goes back to that you're just celebrating a genre of car.
Yeah.
And that whether, again, if it's those cars or an import car or a lifted, Toyota truck.
And then you got Hemmings Muscle Palooza, which is catering just to muscle cars. Yeah. No, and that's, obviously we'll get into the truck shows of it, but there was the mini truck shows, full-size kind of truck shows.
Yeah.
There was also, lifted, there's the lifted truck nationals.
That's right.
And it's a certain genre that you'll get some shows that intermix, but then there's ones that cater just to, a specific thing.
Well, I think we should get into that probably another episode.
Yeah, because there's, a lot more to talk about with trucks. We've got also truck runs to talk about, which is a little bit different, but somewhat similar. But there's a few more on the car show sides that I think we need to talk about, where it's kind of like you said, celebrating a certain kind of car and that style, that look. If we talk about the rockabilly shows and Race of Gentlemen, kind of harkening back to the 40s and the 50s and the 20s, Radwood's another show.
Oh, totally forgot about that.
That's popped up in the last few years that celebrates everything 1980s and 90s.
Yes.
So basically, they started when, if you had something in an 80s vehicle, you couldn't get into Goodguys.
Right.
You couldn't get into a classic car show or a hot rod show, because
Correct.
those were all like 72 and older.
Right.
And, now an 80s, Acura or a, Ford Taurus, SHO from the 90s is nostalgic and popular and classic. So, rare, obviously. So Radwood kind of celebrated that style, and you get people dressing up like, Marty McFly and Zach Morris, all the 80s and 90s stuff.
Right.
So that's kind of celebrating, that genre. But you've also had some shows that is not necessarily built around the car,
right,
but around a certain aspect of the car. So, you got Holly's LS Fest.
True.
And they also have their Hemi, Fest, and they're doing an EV one. So it's basically, here's an engine or a power,
right,
thing, version, category. And then here's all the vehicles it can go in and all the things you can do with it.
Right.
So they've, like, shows like that, they've kind of expanded from your cruising the fairgrounds or doing an autocross, where they're like, okay, we're also going to do a road course.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a drag strip. And we're going to do a drifting competition and the autocross.
Right.
Oh, and let's do some off-road.
And don't forget the donut pit.
And, of course, the donut pit. And that's kind of, we're starting to see more of those shows where there's a show, sitting, basically stand and look at a car.
Yeah.
But then there's also what can you do with it?
Yeah.
From autocross to the donut pit, we got the track takeovers, kind of doing the sideshow, stuff like that. And it's that's the thing. Like, I can only walk around a show
right
that's static for like an hour, and you're kind of like, all right, cool, unless you're hanging out with somebody.
Right.
But if something's happening, something's going on, or you're able to participate in doing something, you're going to stick around a lot longer.
That's also, those are your action shows.
Yeah.
Where there is an action entertainment that has something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that was taken from the idea of, look, we've got a drag race going on over here and there's a car show, let's make the two of them together.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of an evolution that it kind of.
Exactly. And that's gone. Yeah. It was probably the key thing years past was, drag racing and a show.
Right.
Okay. Well, now that's just a show and insert activity.
Exactly.
X,
Yeah.
And there's also kind of more the rally type, where it's kind of a car show, but it's more about the journey of it.
Yeah.
So that's basically, it's just showing how much, all of it's grown. And it's kind of like, if there's a specific niche, specific, genre of car or lifestyle, there's a car show out there for you.
Definitely. I mean, that's everything from your local Kiwanis club all the way up to
your cruise nights, your car meets,
right.
Your little cruise the strip kind of meetups and stuff like that. It's all just about bringing everyone together, enjoying cars, and enjoying the lifestyle that kind of has brought us all together for it.
I agree.
So next time we're going to be doing a little bit something special. We're going to have some guests in here for the first time, and we're going to be talking about truck shows.